The EU was founded as a peace project after World War II in a continent where conquest, oppression, and war were just essentially what happened on a daily basis. And on that basis, who can say it's failed? The EU is home to some of the world's most prosperous, safe, and free societies ever known. But it's also in a fight for its very identity. The migration crisis of 2015 brutally exposed its divisions, indifference to, and active involvement in severe abuses against some of the world's most marginalised people. People who have been forced to flee their countries, their homes, their families, made it to Europe, and then been subjected to unlawful and shameful acts of state violence. As with everything, technology plays a very important role here. On one hand, if you're fleeing, sometimes a phone is one of the most important things that you have. A lifeline if you're trying to find a safe route, find out if your family is okay, or just trying to look at funny videos of something. But on the other hand, they've also become a target for border police. And there are entire systems of surveillance being put in place across Europe to monitor folk who are on the move. To understand what's happened, there's really no one better to speak to than people who are out there trying to directly help those on the move and document the state violence that is being inflicted upon them by European border police. The Border Violence Monitoring Network is a collection of activists and associations, mainly based in Greece and the Balkans. I was lucky enough to get a chance to speak to Natalie and Sergio about their work, the situation on Europe's borders, which is probably among the most urgent rights issues in Europe today, and the role that technology and particularly surveillance plays. Now, we filmed this just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and as of today, more than 2 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, including to some of the same countries that have for years enforced some of the most brutal acts against other migrants. While the reception across Europe has been overwhelmingly positive, with acts of kindness one of the few good things that have come from the Ukrainian invasion, the key here is to make sure that this kind of treatment is sustainable and that we get systemic change to treat all migrants with dignity, and give with protection and with the kindness that they deserve. And there's no one better to underline why this is so important than Sergio and Natalie. Enjoy. Natalie and Sergio, thank you so much for joining today. I've been following a lot of your work for a couple of years now, so I'm really grateful that you found the time this morning. Would it be possible maybe just to introduce some of your work, what kind of inspired you to get involved and what kind of things you're working on at the moment?
First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. Really happy to be here. And yeah, I mean, in general, we are both here because we are part of the Border Violence Monitoring Network, which is a network of more or less 15 grassroots organizations along the so-called Balkan route. So we have partners, actually I am representing Chosur, the partner in Turkey, which is the furthest east. and then we have partners in Greece, in Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Italy, and others joining also. So basically what we are doing is each of us, as the organization that they are doing some kind of solidarity support work with people on the move. And then as a network, we have decided to join forces to document border violence and by now even also internal violence and other issues that people on the move face across Europe's borders. And just to quickly introduce Chosur, which is the organization I'm working for and I co-founded, originally, I am from Austria, and we founded Chosur there in 2015, working on some integration projects. But in March 2020, when the situation between the Greek and Turkish land border escalated and thousands of people were stranded there for a month, me and two other volunteers went there to provide some emergency relief, planning to stay there just for a few weeks. And while working there, realized that there's a huge gap, both in support for survivors of pushbacks and people on the move in the area, but also that there's basically no monitoring happening of the border from the Turkish side. So we ended up staying there. This has been 2 years now. we have two teams. One is located in Istanbul, where I am based as well. And then there's the second one in a city called Edirne in the tri-border area between Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And in both locations, we provide basic support for pushback survivors, which means short-term accommodation so they can rest and recover after their pushback, clothes, because unfortunately most people that are pushed back semi-naked or even completely naked, and then food and whatever else is needed, like I don't know, hygiene products, and unfortunately more and more we have to also provide first aid and organize medical care because the violence keeps increasing. And then in both locations, we offer anybody, we support the opportunity to give a testimony of their pushback, which we then upload to the Border Violence Monitoring Network database and use for advocacy work that we do as the network as well.
Great, thanks, Nat. And Jasur, what's the story behind the name?
Yeah, so basically I co-founded it together with a Syrian refugee. So we chose an Arabic name, which means bridges, and it was originally reflecting to kind of like bridge the gap of refugees that had just arrived and needed to, you know, build a new life, establish a new social support network and so on, but at the same time also bridge language barriers, which are often there, and cultural differences. And then moving to Turkey, it was interesting because both in Turkish and in Farsi, which is what we learned after we came here, there's the word jasur, it's slightly pronounced differently, it means brave. So we're lucky that the other meaning is also a fitting one, I guess.
Thank you, Natalie. Sergio?
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Edin and Privacy International for the invitation. I'm so happy as well as Natalie for being here and to be part of the podcast. I'm in Spain right now, where the organization Ampar Non Kitchen is from. It is based here in some region in Spain because it was founded by some person from Asturias, this region in Spain. And right now we are in 5 different places. We are as well in Spain, but not of Africa, in Ceuta, that is like the south or north door of the European Union in terms of the borders. And we are as well in Balkans and Greece. We are in Bosnia and in Serbia, and we are in the city of Patras in Greece. Mainly we were starting the project in Serbia, and the story around the project was a bit funny because there were some people in Athens doing some kind of activists looking for how was the situation, and there were some rumors of people in Belgrade in the old barracks where thousands of people were gathering in the winter of 2016-17. So they decided to go to Belgrade and to see with their eyes the real situation, and it was so unbelievable how the people were living in the barracks and what was the conditions of these people. So they just decided to start cooking one night. They bought 3 big pans and 2 stoves, and they start cooking for one night just to try to support these people with some food. And then they decide to stay, and one night after the other, they start cooking and cooking. And at some point, they realize they will need to stay there because the situation was awful. But after that, the authorities in Belgrade, they demolished the barracks because they wanted to build some luxury housing in the area. So all these people were moved to some camps in Serbia, but the majority went to the north, to the border with Croatia. So the people there, we were starting the organization, they decided to move there. So when we were in Sid, in this small city town in the border with Croatia, we start as well supporting people with food and clothes and some kind of hygiene and medical treatment. And then we start listening to people who were coming back from Croatia, and we start listening about these stories of these deportations or illegal deportations, what we call pushbacks. And then we start realizing that something was happening and was systematic, that the Croatian authorities were pushing back people trying to reach Europe, Italy, Slovenia, other countries, Austria, and they were coming back in awful conditions. Natalie mentioned that some of them, I think the situation in the Balkans and Turkey, Greece is the same. They were coming back with anything. The authorities removed the clothes, the phones, money, they took money, they beat them up. So they were coming without anything and also injured. So we realized it was the moment to start some kind of movement or project or political action to make testimony of these incidents. So as Natalie mentioned, we start with together with another organization, grassroots organization in SID, Ricardo from Germany. We start collecting the testimonies at the beginning, very naive way, but then we start developing really professional methodology to collect these testimonies, and as Natalie mentioned, to make some kind of advocacy and awareness in the future. So that was how the network, BBM, Border Virus Monitoring Network, was born in this region in SID, and then more and more partners join forces in the network we have today. That is huge, and we are doing an amazing job.
Definitely. And you mentioned the camps in 2016, and Natalie, I think you said Jusur was started in 2015. What was kind of context behind then for like a non-European audience around about that time? And what was the kind of political reaction by the EU and the individual EU member states? And has much really changed since then? I mean, that was like 6 years ago now, unbelievably.
Almost 7.
7, oh my God.
I mean, in general, the context is that 2015, several years after the war started in Syria, there was quite a big increase in refugees arriving in Europe. Why 2015, not before, is because, of course, it takes some time for people to actually like get further. And most of the people in the beginning of the war didn't think it would last that long. So they just moved to first were internally displaced, then maybe moved across the border to Turkey, to Lebanon, and were kind of waiting for the war to end. And then when it became clear the war wouldn't end, people were trying to establish a life. And then I think it's important to know the context in Turkey, that asylum as we know it in Europe doesn't exist here, because when Turkey signed the Geneva Conventions, they put a geographical limitation in place, meaning that only refugees fleeing Europe can apply for asylum as it's described in the Geneva Conventions in Turkey. When the Syrian war started, there was basically no concept of international protection in Turkey. And then in response to the large number of Syrians residing in Turkey already, basically, the Turkish government made some new some amendments to residency law, which allowed Syrians to obtain temporary international protection. But there's a huge difference between asylum as it is actually meant to be according to the Geneva Conventions, and the rights that people who obtain temporary protection in Turkey have. So then, partly because of this reason, and partly because people realized the war would not end anytime soon, lots of them decided to find a place where they can actually build a new life, which is really not possible if you don't have permanent residency here. So then people started going to Greece in really big numbers. There were daily arrivals of I don't know, even dozens or sometimes some days hundreds of boats on the Greek islands. And eventually a large number of people were stranded in Idomeni, which is at the northern borders of the Greek mainland. And I don't know how detailed we should go into this, but basically all along the Balkans, people were kind of piling up in the sense that there were thousands of them stranded at different, I don't know, bus stops, train stations, and so on. And then especially in Budapest, in Hungary, where the government basically said to Austria and Germany and so on, which were some, like especially Germany was the main destination for many Syrians because there was already a community there, basically said, like, we will just let these people cross. We cannot like keep them anymore. And then there was in summer 2015, end of summer 2015, this decision by the Austrian and German governments to open the borders and let people cross. And in general, in this, it was, I think it's often referred to as the summer of solidarity, where I still remember in Austria, across different groups in the population, everybody was helping in one way or another. It was really awkward if you didn't do anything to help these people pass through or arrive in Austria. Some of them decided to stay in Austria, and that was a couple of months maybe where it was a kind of a state of emergency, but in a sense that was really positive and optimistic and empowering. I think, like the feeling that people from all different parts of the society come together simply to help other people was really motivating and inspiring, I think. And it's also, I think, therefore no surprise that most of the organizations that make up BVMN were started in that time, or actually developed out of initiatives that formed spontaneously at that time. And then, unfortunately, very quickly, the sentiment towards the refugees coming to or through Europe turned, and the borders were closed, shut, which I realized after starting working here at Border Violence Stuff that I actually witnessed that myself. I was working at that time, I was at different borders, just doing whatever was possible to do. And I was at the Hungarian-Serbian border on the Hungarian side when we heard that there are 3,000 people on the other side of the border. So we sent a scout team, 3 cars with each 2 people and a few tents and some food to the Serbian side. And as I was the last of the 3 cars crossing the border, and as soon as we had crossed to Serbia, a woman came running after the car. So I stopped, I was asking her what she wants. And she's like, what just happened? I'm a journalist for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, this German newspaper. What just happened? I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, look behind you. So I looked behind me and I saw soldiers like pulling this huge like concrete wall across the highway, literally closing the border. After that, there was still a few weeks of where people were able to, instead of going through Hungary to Austria and then to Germany, go through Croatia. But basically at that point, the decision was made, I think, to close the Balkan route. And what that meant is exactly what we are working on now. People didn't stop coming, but it meant that border guards started violently preventing people from entering and even removing people from the territory in a pushback, as is what we are calling this collective expulsion. Since then, a lot has changed. Basically, in the beginning, this was happening at only specific borders and not as systematic as now. And now it has actually become, like in the context of Greece, I'm talking about the pushback machinery usually, because by now it has become so coordinated and there's so many resources going into it, and so many actors involved in it, that it's really like, it is a systematic thing, and it's actually, I think, a hallmark of the whole border regime by now. And at the same time, it kept expanding across borders. So by now, there are pushbacks from Austria to Slovenia, as Sergio already mentioned. There are pushbacks from France to Italy. There are pushbacks like all across Europe, basically happening. So it's not individual countries that took that decision. It's a strategy of Europe as a whole to keep people out and deter them from coming.
And I think it kind of back then coincided with like a great weaponization of this issue by various like political forces across Europe. Saw how the done that, I think, really effectively. But I mean, the facts are that vast majority of displaced people and people on the move remain internally displaced within the countries of origin and in poorer countries as well. So even though, like, you know, when I was in the UK at the time, we had like these images of people in lines just essentially being depicted as invading Europe, whereas like the facts were that vast majority of people still remained in Lebanon, for example. Again, going back to then, there was this kind of push by the European Union and I think Germany in particular to make a deal with the surrounding states and particularly with Turkey. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about what that deal was and what it led to?
So basically, I think this deal was the biggest mistake Europe could have made. And that's what became obvious in 2020. And since, basically, the deal was that Turkey would receive money and some other incentives like an ease of travel, like visa-free travel, and an expansion of the economic trading zone between Europe and Turkey and so on, in exchange for keeping people in Turkey and preventing them from going to European Union territory. That in and of itself is highly problematic because, as I mentioned already, there is no asylum in Turkey. At the same time, it's highly problematic because, of course, this gives a big leverage to Turkey to basically blackmail the EU. And I don't think it's as easy as saying that's exactly what happened in 2020. What also happened before is that the EU did not keep up its part of the deal, only transferred a part of the money, at the same time not move in any way on the other promises made. But basically, I think it was foreseeable from the start that this is exactly what would happen. And it has happened since exactly what we've seen since last summer with the border between Poland and Belarus. Happened before also with Morocco, where Sergio probably can tell you more about this. I find it shocking that there's basically no discussion in European political field about maybe we should switch tactics. Maybe we should not keep paying authoritarian neighbors to keep people out. I don't know. Yeah, to be honest, I find it, to be honest, I always feel like the goal of Europe, the only response Europe has to the fact that people have always migrated and will keep migrating, whether that's forced migration or not, the only response Europe has is keep people out at any cost. And this is an unrealistic and honestly also naive idea that you can achieve that, and especially by paying off other countries.
It's kind of short term as well, because what's the inevitable consequence of maintaining a border region of authoritarian dictators that you're empowering just for the short term goal of, you know, keeping people in place? You mentioned Morocco. Sergio, I don't know if you want to just explain what happened in Morocco. I think it was only a few months ago now.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly about that, about this border regime that somehow started in 2016 when the closing of the borders. Natalie mentioned like how she experienced the reality in Austria and Hungary. And I was thinking this EU-Turkey deal, it's quite similar of the situation in North Africa, in Ceuta and Melilla, that are these autonomous cities that is Spanish soil, but is in African territory and is part of Morocco. So at some point, the Spanish government and through European fundings are paying Morocco to keep the people on the move coming to Europe. So they are like reinforcing the measures in the border through Morocco and Spain. But they are also using this as a leverage. Like you mentioned, it was last year in May 2021 when the Moroccan government opened the door and 20,000 people from Morocco just entered in the Spanish soil in this small autonomous city of Ceuta. That was crazy how they make this political movement to try to push a bit the Spanish government or also the European Union around these economical issues they have also with Algeria. But yeah, it was more or less the same. If you give this power to some authoritarian regimes like Morocco or Turkey, they then get this power to push you on how they open and close the doors for people to come. So I think it's more or less the same story.
Definitely. I mean, I read that was in particular was like related to a decision regarding Western Sahara as well. So there's all these kind of like internal issue, anything that you want to push at the EU, you know that you've got that kind of stick, and essentially you know that they'll bow down to whatever you want.
Originally, my background is in international development, and it's not just what we've described now, that like direct neighbors of the EU are like that the EU is trying to make deals with its direct neighbors. It goes much, much further than that. By now, almost all the development aid or the development cooperation between Europe and Africa, also countries much further south in Africa, is tied to certain conditions regarding migration and keeping people like from migrating or passing through countries. And it started actually already like also with the direct neighbors, it started long before the EU-Turkey deal with Libya. Sometimes it's bilateral deals between, for example, Italy and Libya. Sometimes it's the EU as a whole. But yeah, I mean, this is highly problematic on so many levels, where it's like, of course, what's happening now when Turkey, when Morocco, when Belarus decide to play with people's lives as a political pawn, that is obviously a problematic, but also tying aid, which should actually be reparation for colonialization, tying aid to conditions regarding migration is also really problematic.
We're able to speak to another journalist, Giacomo, who's working on sub-Saharan Africa and particularly Niger, and it's just wild how, you know, you've seen these kind of deals all the way like that far south, but also with that comes the facilitation of like surveillance equipment and drones all the way from Niger up to Belarus. That seems to be the priority at the moment, unfortunately. So yeah, going back to the effect of these decisions that did happen for people that are on the move, what did that essentially mean to them, and what was the subsequent treatment of them by authorities inside the European Union? Like when you're at the border regions, are they, you mentioned earlier, Natalie, the treatment you think has got more systematic. Is that, do you think, mean worse for them? Can you describe some of the incidents that you've seen? Or?
To be honest, since we've been working on this, I keep thinking, wow, it can't get any worse, and it keeps getting worse basically every week. 2 weeks ago, I was at the border between on the Turkish side of the border with Greece, because we were doing a research project regarding quantitative estimations of locals in the villages immediately at the border about how many people they see returned every day. It is something that happens every day in the hundreds, or if not thousands. And while we were there, 21 people died within 3 days that we were there. They froze to death, and half of them were found almost naked. It was -9 degrees during the night. And the thing is that when people are pushed back since 2020, they are not taken to the Turkish side of the river anymore. They are either driven until, like, ferried until the middle of the river and then told to jump into the water, or they are dropped, abandoned on these small islands, which is basically just sandbanks with some trees in the middle of the river. And so people are wet. They don't have any clothes or hardly any clothes. And it was -9 degrees. So yeah, to be honest, like, it has become so much worse that I can't even describe it. Like it's incredibly traumatic, and it's really has huge impact for people, not just immediately due to the physical violence they have, but also what it does to their psychology what it does to the psychology of people working. I personally have secondary trauma on the level that I cannot take testimonies anymore, because hearing those stories again and again and again just gets too much at some point. And then much less imagining living that, because people don't have a choice. So they keep trying. It's not like they try once, they get pushed back, they're like, oh shit, now I'm gonna go home. They cannot. So basically, the average number of pushbacks people have that we take testimonies of now is at least 10 pushbacks. I see this happen every time. Like, we take a testimony of someone who was pushed back for the first time. They say, I will never do this again. I cannot do this again. I will try to stay here in Turkey and like survive here. And then maybe 2 months later, 3 months later, 5 months later, they see they have no other choice because they cannot build a life here. And then they are forced to try again. And then it leads to some people, like the highest amount I've heard was a guy who had 65 pushbacks. In general, a pushback means that people who are crossing or have just crossed the border are not registered as they should be, are not given their right to apply for asylum if that's what they wish. They are not even like, in no way formally registered that they have ever arrived. They are simply taken and then expelled back across the border that they came from. So this is what it was initially. Initially, that meant in the usually militarized zones, right at the border, people who had just arrived were stopped and then told to go back or beaten across the border. But what has happened since then, and this is why I'm calling it a pushback machinery, not just pushbacks anymore, in Greece, what happens is that people all over the country, on the mainland now, people all over the country are apprehended, whether they have residence permits or not. There were so many cases we had where people actually were in the asylum process, were waiting for their asylum interview, and were taken from camps even to be brought to the border with Turkey and then expelled. So that's actually not a pushback according to the original definition of pushback. That's a collective expulsion. And what happens in Greece, it's incredibly systematic in the sense that people are brought through different jurisdictions, sometimes 5, 6 different jurisdictions, handed over from one group of police to another, from one police station to another. In the end, when they reach the militarized zone, they are kept in incommunicado detention sites, which are sometimes just like warehouse-like buildings. Sometimes even they describe being kept in the open with just some kind of tin roof and some fence around it. They are usually, like, this process of a pushback from further inside the mainland usually lasts between 2 and 4 or 5 days, because initially it was only the group that was apprehended that was pushed back, but by now it's so systematized that they basically make sure to gather lots of people. So the average number of people we have in a group that's pushed back to Turkey from Greece at the moment is around 80. Sometimes there are groups of 200 people. And so they are kept in detention. In detention, even if it's 4 or 5 days of detention, they don't get water, they don't get food, they don't have access to medical care. They often have their medicine that they have with them taken from them. Usually everything they have is taken from them, including clothes. We had this case recently where a person who is HIV positive had 8 months of medication with them. The Greek police took it all. And also they take the documents, their passports, whatever. We've had 6 cases where people have actually already obtained asylum in Austria, Germany, and Belgium, and then went to Greece either to visit relatives that had just arrived there or to look for missing relatives, and then were apprehended, had their documents from Austria, from Germany, from Belgium stolen by police, and were brought to Turkey. We currently have this phenomenon of Cubans, which are able to fly visa-free to Serbia. And then some of them are told or attempt themselves to cross the land borders to Greece in the hopes of then from EU territory in Greece being able to fly to Spain, which is their final destination. So they had never been to Turkey before. And as soon as they enter Greece, the police takes them to the border with Turkey through this whole process that I described, and then pushes them back. And in this case, it's not even a pushback, because pushing back requires that they had been in Turkey before. They had never been. We currently have 65 Cubans in Turkey, and they all started in groups of 2 or 3 or even alone. This by itself, this expulsion without a formal procedure, is completely illegal according to national law, EU law, and international law. But more than that, there is a huge level of violence and other inhumane treatment involved. Basically, there is systematic torture involved. In Greece, we have this annual torture report where we just gather like the information we get from all the testimonies we take. In 2020, in Greece, 89% of testimonies described at least one form of torture in detention or during the pushback, usually both. And then this number has increased even more in 2021. By now, it's 98% of all groups that are pushed back that describe having been exposed to at least one form of torture. And it's so indiscriminate that even children, women, pregnant women, old people, disabled people, everybody is being beaten. Everybody has their clothes taken from them. In each detention site, whether official police station or warehouse style detention, people are forced to undress completely. Sometimes they are given some clothes back, sometimes not. They are strip searched. Women are searched by men. Children are sometimes searched, like frisked properly. Yeah, and then the pushback itself, I would say by now almost always involves violence in all the borders. Which type of violence varies a bit. Whether people are kept in detention first or not varies. So for example, we have half the testimonies we take are from Bulgaria, actually, half are from Greece. In Bulgaria, it's still as it used to be in Greece, that small groups are apprehended at the border and taken back without detention usually, but 50% of the testimonies from Bulgaria include police dog attacks. So they come back with really bad bite marks, half of them. Yeah, and this is the land borders. In Greece, you also have the sea. And what changed there is that people who, like for a long time, the Greek Coast Guard basically just prevented people from entering Greek waters, in the sense that they would stop the boats, the dinghies that people are crossing in. They would disable the engine or take it away, whatever. Sometimes also even puncture holes into the inflatable sections of the boats, and then just create waves to push them back across the border and into Turkish waters, and wait for the Turkish Coast Guard to pick them up. What changed since 2020 is that the Greek Coast Guard not only does this anymore, but also uses life rafts to put people on, even people who already arrived on Greek islands, set foot on Greek territory. Sometimes we had this testimony where a group was already inside a camp talking to UNHCR staff to ask for asylum, and then still was taken back out to sea, abandoned in these life rafts. And again, it's the same procedure, that people are beaten, people are robbed of all their belongings, and then set basically adrift in these life rafts that they cannot steer, and it's usually completely overcrowded. And not only this, but we have had several testimonies, and just yesterday an investigative report was published that proves that this is happening, that the Hellenic Coast Guard also sometimes does not only set people adrift on these life rafts, but simply throw them into the sea without any boats, any rafts. And people die. People die both on the land borders and on the sea.
Yeah, and the evidence of that investigation was, I mean, there's no denying it, essentially, was there? Even though I think the governments in the region, they still have this facade of saying that these things don't exist, because, as you say, it is supposedly illegal. When you enter a country, you are supposedly allowed to apply for asylum. That's the whole thing that makes kind of pushbacks illegal. But it's so systematic. It's like almost kind of laughable to deny it at this stage.
I would like to add, because Natalie mentioned this investigation last October that showed how the Croatian authorities were pushing back. They were recorded. We collect a lot of testimonies from people who were pushed back from Croatia by the Croatian authorities, and they told us that the Croatian authorities are like developing new strategies, for example, on beating, trying to beat in some areas of the body that doesn't make any sign. So then they try to prevent this picture image of people with wounds or marks in the body to be shown as a proof. So they are trying to develop these new strategies. And I think last week, on the end of February, there was released some copy of a directive from some police station in Croatia, Bajoko border. The deputy commander sent like a directive to the subordinates, mainly saying that you need to be more careful when you are carrying the pushbacks, because we need to be aware that the media, civil society activists, they are trying to get some footage, some proofs to start some cases. So I will say that they got some kind of attention to this activity that the people is doing, but they are trying to find some ways to still doing what they are doing, that as Natalie mentioned, is clearly systematic. And at least where we are in the Croatian border with Bosnia and Serbia, what we are witnessing is practically the same. The people is stripped of clothes and belongings, money, phones, that is super important for people on the move. But they are also suffering like sexual abuses, sexual harassment. I was listening the stories from Natalie, from the testimonies, and I was really listening the same testimonies we are taking in the Croatian border, where people is taken in like a detention for many hours without clothes. They also put them in the vans, like the police vans, where they take the people to the Bosnian or Serbian border, and they put like the air conditioning really low, so the people is freezing inside the vans when they are driving for hours till the border, and they are suffering. We have a lot of testimonies where people is suffering sexual abuses. They are forced to undress and simulate that they are having sex with other members of the group they are traveling. So it's a terrible story, and I think it's the same from Croatian border to the Turkey border.
The thing is, it's ridiculous that they still deny, but they just simply call it Turkish fake news. They use this conflict, and of course, then they use it against anybody who is reporting about it. Like I have 2 criminal cases in Greece against me because of this work that I'm doing, and in one of them, they accuse Josur and 3 other organizations of forming a criminal network, and then they accuse us of espionage, violation of state secrets, and facilitation of illegal entry, which is smuggling without profit. So they use this argument. This is also like, why espionage? Just because we are in Turkey reporting about what Greece is doing.
And it's so indiscriminate, like an actual person working for the EU border guard was caught up in that at one point, weren't they?
Yes, but they still deny it.
So you mentioned like some of your experiences of being criminalized. Is that, Sergio, maybe, I don't know if you know, is that like a systematic thing for people working on frontline and solidarity work?
We were mentioning this image of thousands of people coming to Europe, invading Europe, and this image of people being held by some locals in different places. Because in the beginning, before they closed the border, they start with this regime, with this securitization of the border, adding more and more stuff like walls, fences, like the securitization with the drones and some technological stuff. People were more receptive. They were helping all these people from, Natalie mentioned, the majority were from Syria, but also from Kosovo, from Afghanistan, and people were really willing to help. But after the years developed, we have witnessing that the people, local people, are becoming to be not scary, but feeling that the solidarity they can provide can be also criminalized by the authorities. It's not just the international solidarity, people coming from different places of Europe to help these people to support, but also the locals. I have heard some stories that the people in the Croatian border, they really pretend not to know about these pushbacks that are happening, even if they can see from their houses, but they are so afraid of say anything because they can also be threatened by the authorities, even if in their own country. So I can see this criminalization being broader than just international organizations trying to support, but also with the locals, that is making even more difficult for the people on the move to try to reach Europe, because they don't find just the border. They find that the people is forced to not help because they are afraid of even to give a blanket can be seen as facilitating human trafficking or smuggling. That our volunteers in the field, in different places, they have like a lot of problems with the authorities just by providing some blankets or food or health treatments. They can be accused of facilitating or being part of a smuggling network just to provide some basic support to these people on the move.
That report you mentioned in October, again, just undeniable, the evidence that was produced that there was a systematic campaign of pushbacks. It's available if you search for Lighthouse reports. And they managed, essentially, they put cameras used for hunting and drones and got footage of the pushbacks in action. And it's published across media in Europe, and that's available online.
And the most critical was that the reaction by the authorities, the Croatian authorities, was to blame or to punish just 3 officers. But it was something punctual, not systematic. It was like some putrid apples, but in the basket, but not something in general. But it's not true. It's a systematic reality.
My problem with how these cases are usually reported on or presented in the public is that the focus is on the criminalization of solidarity. But the only reason this is happening is because migration itself and migrants themselves are criminalized. It's because Europe, not just Europe, actually, I mean, this is a global issue, like pushbacks is a global issue. It happens in Central America, it happens in Southeast Asia, it happens everywhere. And the main thing that allows for this even is the narrative that migration is a security threat. And that allows for criminalization of migrants themselves. And this is what usually is completely underreported, that there are probably tens of thousands of migrants in prison without proper trials or with ridiculous trials, with ridiculously long sentences, because they were on the boat and maybe we were the ones who had a satellite phone. So the authorities decided you must be the smuggler. And things like that. There was this case in Greece last year where a father lost his son because their boat capsized off a Greek island. The son drowned, and then the authorities asked him to come to the morgue, identify the body of his 6-year-old son. And right after he identified him, they put him in prison and charged him with endangerment of his own son's life, because they were like, you wouldn't have had to go on the boat. And then he received 52 years in prison for that. And so the focus is often on the criminalization of solidarity, because people who work in solidarity networks have the privilege also to have lawyers, to have access to media, have the position to be able to speak out about all this. In our case that I mentioned already, we are 35 people. 33 of us are members of 4 different NGOs, and 2 of us are people on the move, who are the only ones who were already imprisoned, and who are the only ones who cannot publicly speak about this because they are still in Greece. They are hoping to still get asylum in Europe, and they do not have the privilege to speak about all this. And so it's, and on one hand it's that, on the other hand, yes, it's so wide within BVMN. More than half of our member organizations are currently being criminalized in many different ways. Some of it is lawsuits, like hours, like, or criminal investigations and then trials, but there's also a lot of other forms of repression. And actually there's a really interesting report some of our Western Balkan members published, I think in 2020 or 2020, I'm not sure. It's called Shrinking Spaces. And it describes exactly that the problem and the effect of this criminalization. It's that the space for civil society to be active and engaged is shrinking constantly due to this repression. And then of course the space for migrants to actually like exist is shrinking. And I think it's a huge threat to our democracy, to our freedom. And I'm not talking about us as activists or as people working in solidarity, but in general, because once this process of dehumanizing a certain group and then criminalizing them and then criminalizing those supporting them directly, once this process is started, it keeps extending. And we see this already in the last 2 years. More and more journalists reporting about this have been arrested or had experienced some form of repression. More and more lawyers representing either people on the move or people like us who are criminalized because supporting people on the move. Lawyers are being criminalized. Doctors are being criminalized if they treat people. And I don't think there's any stopping to this. And I don't think that the majority of European citizens are aware of this threat of basically, us due to the fear of migration, basically giving up all the values that, for example, the European Union was founded on and that we are so proud of. We are destroying it.
It's such a good point. I guess kind of underlying all of that is this issue of racism and neocolonialism and how big a part it has to play, not just in terms of the policies, but also within our reporting of it and what eventually makes it to the headlines as well.
Recently, I know this is maybe a provocative comparison, but I'm so sure. Like I gave up hope that in the next few years things will get better, because they are continuously getting so much worse that I'm certain that in the next, 5 years, we will only see escalation after escalation. But I am sure that one day, maybe in a few decades, maybe in 100 years, I don't know, but one day we will look back on this border regime and we will look at it and talk about it as we are now talking about slavery system. I think it's really exactly the same. It's this capitalist, colonialist, racist reasoning that allows for this to happen.
I mean, I remember when in 2015, it was kind of being talked about as like a challenge to the EU itself in terms of whether we control migration. But I think it is the challenge to the EU itself in terms of sticking to its values, and it's failed. And I think that was the bigger war I lost eventually.
I also really see the possibility that the EU will collapse in the discussion around how to handle this topic, because there are these two blocks between countries, but also within countries between different parties. And I don't see in any way that there's any progress in finding a joint response. And I do think the way that this has been prioritized, that this subject has been prioritized for the past 6-7 years, if we can't find a joint response on this question, it can be the end of the EU even.
Kind of just take us a wee bit back. The kind of general narrative is that people that are providing frontline support are inadvertently or actively driving not just migration, but also the trade in facilitating migration. How do you respond to that?
Well, we as in the kitchen, we are working in the border, but we are not working with people in camps. That is something. When we start this conversation, we were talking about camps and about what developed in the 2016 when the border were closing and all these people were stopped from coming to Europe on an easy way. And then many people were moved to camps that should have been temporary, but in the end they were becoming detention centers for many people. So the people we are working in the different regions is people that denies to be inside a camp because they know that being in a camp will make the journey slower, and it will take a lot of time due to this bureaucratic process that claiming for asylum is so painful for many people. So all the testimonies we collect is from people who are trying to do the journey on their own. If we are not there, they're gonna stop coming. I don't think so.
Definitely, I think that's the point. I think Jasur have a great kind of explainer on that as well. That I was reading recently, just because there's no data to back that up whatsoever.
This narrative, it came originally from the search and rescue field again. And first of all, I think it's a disgusting discourse because I remember, I don't know exactly when, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, I don't know, there was a headline for exactly an article discussing this in a German newspaper. The headline read, "Should we save them or not?" What does that mean? What does it mean if we don't? We let people drown. This is the one thing that is still, I think, like the one international law that is still widely respected globally is the maritime law, which means that whoever is in distress, there's a duty to rescue them. And whatever happens afterwards is another discussion, but should we save them or not? What kind of a question is that? And this was not a right-wing newspaper. This was a mainstream newspaper, widely read. So we have gotten very far in this discourse about just imagine that there's a boat of white people with European passports in distress, and somebody goes, "Should we save them or not? I'm not sure." Like, that would never happen. And there's also, like, there's not only no data backing up that this narrative of the pull factor created by NGOs, whether now in search and rescue or in the support work BVMN organizations do. Not only is there no data backing that claim up, but there's also a lot of data that actually shows that in the months where all the search and rescue ships, for example, in the Central Med were, thanks to repression and criminalization, not able to operate, there was absolutely no decrease in people attempting. And to be honest, if you think about it logically, like especially in the search and rescue context where this argument most often is cited, someone who leaves from somewhere, let's say somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, will not go through the whole hell of Libya if they don't have a reason to, other than, but then the NGOs rescue me in the Med. That it doesn't make any sense. People, like, yeah, anyways, and honestly, is the same thing, like no matter how much violence is used in pushbacks, people still keep trying. It's not about convenience. Like, all that NGOs, like BVMN organizations can do is provide some kind of convenience, like some kind of basic thing, like, here you have a blanket so you don't freeze to death in the forest. Here you have some food so you don't starve, or maybe some band-aid for an injury. I don't know. That's basically all we can do. And people who keep attempting to cross after being tortured will not have the like if you take torture, if you take the risk to actually drown, or see it happen and then still try again, this is not because somebody will give you a blanket and some food afterwards. This is because you have no other choice.
We cannot forget that the solidarity we were mentioning is not just international or local, it's also within the people on the move. So even if we, Non-in-Kitchen or Collective Aid or other partners of the network, we are not in the border providing some blankets or some clothes, the people on the move, they are solidary with other people on the move, that when they are pushed back and then they come back without anything, they help each other. They provide food, clothes, blankets, if they don't have anything. So even if we are not there, they are gonna be able to continue with the journey, because sometimes we forget that these people are making the journey for months, years even, and they start in Pakistan, Afghanistan, sub-Saharan countries, and we providing some support in the border with Croatia is just a patch that we just try to provide some support. Also, the most important is to denounce and to carry this awareness or advocacy work we are doing within the network. But really to be there as a supporters is like a drop in a glass of water. We are not giving them the real support because they provide within themselves. And about funds, as I mentioned before, is one of the key elements. On the one hand, is the key element for people on the move to make the journey. And we sometimes forget that we right now in our cities, we depend on GPS just to go to do the shopping or to go to visit somebody, because it's so important for us in this century. So just imagine, for people on the move, we need to try the best way to reach some familiars in Europe. But on the other hand, the response of the authorities is to focus on the phones, on the one hand, to make it more difficult this travel, but also to take it as a leverage to push on these smuggling networks that they are trying to figure out, and to as we mentioned about this GPS phone, but also everyone with a phone can be accused of being a smuggler within the group because he or she has a phone to guide the others through a forest, for example. So that is why they focus on these phones. They destroy and they try to make it more difficult, this navigation for people on the move, thinking that this is gonna make them going back to Pakistan or Afghanistan after years of traveling. But in the reality is not like that. Even if they destroy their phones, they are keeping trying to reach Europe.
A huge reason probably for authorities immediately when apprehending people taking the phones is to make it impossible to collect footage and evidence on what they are then doing to them. And at the same time, we know that in several locations, at least, authorities take the phones and then sell them on the black market. That's actually an interesting discussion in general. How do they finance pushbacks? Because it is an illegal practice and it does require a lot of resources that they cannot put in an official budget. So of course they take all the cash that people have on them and they take all the phones. They make money out of this, and at least I know this for Greece, and Sergio already yesterday we discussed this a bit, said the same in Croatia, right? Yeah, and then the question of what else do they do with the phones before they sell it is something that we can't really know, because this is another issue in this whole context that we are working in, that there is by now basically zero transparency about what is happening and who is doing what. And we are trying a lot as a network to file freedom of information requests with Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, or with other different authorities. And this used to work quite well until a few years ago. But over the last 2 years, Frontex basically and other authorities are just becoming increasingly intransparent, refuse to give out any basic information even. And we cannot be sure what exactly they do. For sure, when they decide to criminalize someone, they go through the phones and try to find any kind of evidence that they were, I don't know, doing whatever. I personally know, because I was in touch with this one, he was Palestinian, here in Turkey, and then he had some health issues and I was organizing medical care for him. And then I tried to reach him, and for 5 days or something, he was consistently online, but didn't respond. And I found that's quite weird. And then a few weeks later, he reached out to me from another number saying he tried to get to Greece. They took his phone and he's back in Turkey now. And so basically what I'm sure happened is that, like, then he told me which day he was arrested, apprehended in Greece and so on. So basically these 5 days that he was consistently online, actually the police had his phone. So they apparently took the phone from him and then must have put it on charge, and consistently had it on for like 5 days. And I'm talking about on WhatsApp, he was online consistently for 5 days, this number. I don't know why exactly they do that, what exactly what kind of data they try to get. But I also know that the one of the two people I mentioned who are in our criminal case, he's an unaccompanied Afghan minor who was initially, like, he arrived on the island of Lesbos in Greece after 38 hours at sea, after the Greek Coast Guard repeatedly attempted to push him back. Eventually, because of his actions, he and his group made it to Lesbos. What he did was that he started filming, or live streaming, actually, on social media, live streaming from this boat, showing the boat, the hole the Greek Coast Guard had made into the boat, showing that the engine was destroyed, showing how the Greek Coast Guard ships were passing by, creating waves in order to push them back to Turkey. Eventually, a Turkish Frontex liaison officer saw this video, showed it to the German Frontex team that he was on board with on a ship nearby. And then the German Frontex officers decided to intervene. This is a very rare occurrence. Sometimes they do still intervene and help people instead of supporting pushbacks. So in this case, they sent a speedboat to actually pull the dinghy to shore. And 2 days after he arrived on Lesbos, undercover police came to the camp and were saying they would register people for the camp of Moria, which never happens at the coast. They were in a quarantine camp at that time. There were many other people who had been there for weeks and were not registered yet. And they were only interested in registering the people from his boat, which was a mixed group of, half of them were Afghans, the other half was from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They only wanted to register the Afghans. And then when they were asking them the questions of, like, during the registration process, they were asking also for the make and model of their phones, which is not a normal question to ask. He was smart enough to basically, like, not show his phone, not have it with him, because he assumed already that it might be connected. And still a month later, when all the others from his group were transferred to the camp, from this quarantine camp to the actual camp, he disappeared. And then it took me a few weeks researching among the Afghan community to find out what happened, and he was imprisoned, 16 years old at that time. And for 6 months, no, in the end, sorry, 7 months, he was imprisoned without charges. A few months after, I think it must have been 4 months after he was imprisoned, we found out why, but we immediately, of course, organized lawyers and tried to understand what are they charging him with. And all they told the lawyers, for a month, they didn't even give access to the lawyers. After a month, they allowed the lawyer inside. And then all they told the lawyer was, he's a threat to public security, but there are no charges against him. And then they published this press release about the criminal case against all of us, which then made us understand that there were no charges because the investigation was still ongoing. Anyways, so in this case, it was exactly that. They found out that he was the one who was live streaming this pushback, basically. And afterwards, we connected him to journalists to speak about it, and we published his testimony, of course. So that is what made him end up imprisoned for 7 months. He's out now, but completely destroyed. Like, they made him on purpose addicted to really heavy, like basically to benzos. He's been on withdrawal the first weeks after he came out. And since this is more than a year now that he came out, he is unable to leave his room because he got so used to being confined in a tiny space in prison that he can't handle getting out of the house anymore.
So they're basically kind of looking for evidence of people documenting crimes?
Basically, they charged him on the same charges as us, which is espionage and violation of state secrets. The only, we still don't have access to the file after more than 1.5 years of this ongoing case against us. Our lawyers still don't have access to the actual file, but some of it was leaked from police to media. And in that letter that was leaked from the Lesbos police department to the headquarters in Athens, basically they are saying we were sharing state secrets, and the only thing us or other organizations involved were sharing is, for example, footage of Coast Guard performing pushbacks.
I think something important that you, Natalie, mentioned is about this lack of transparency from the authorities, from Frontex. We don't know really what they are doing with the phones they are taking. What we know from our experience in the field, from the testimonies we collect, besides this black market, Natalie mentioned that it's also happening in both sides of the Balkans. And we collect some testimonies of people telling that they were able to buy again the phone that the authorities took from them. So it was like a loop. You take the phone, put it in a black market, you sell to the people on the move, and then take again. So it's a crazy story. But what we know from these testimonies we are collecting is that people is aware that the police is going to catch them at some point, and they're going to look inside the phones. As Natalie mentioned, the authorities will force these people to unlock the phone even if they don't want. That is, they also use the phones as a leverage to diminish the people on the move. They open the phones, they look through social media, they use it like something to laugh on the people, to make mocking them, and to also use this psychological violence, or not physical, but mental violence. So as we know from some testimonies is that people is aware of that. So some strategies they adapt is try to remove like personal information or pictures from the phones, trying to diminish these encounters with authorities when they try to deep into the phones. But at the same time, when some authorities find that some phones look like new, they don't have some pictures or information, they get suspicious and start making questions why your phone doesn't have any picture. Then they try to connect, trying to find some contacts within the phone, trying to find the smuggler within the group, who is the smuggler, who has the contact with the smuggler. That is, again, Natalie mentioned that the most important is that we don't have really evidence of pushbacks apart from this investigation, like from Lighthouse report. It's true that we don't have evidence because the authorities take the phones and delete image, or they broke the phones, even if they are not the expensive one that they put in the black market, the cheapest one, they just broke the glasses, they charging units, they make it not working again. But sometimes people on the move is able to hide some phones or to take some footage or to maybe record on live. So sometimes we got some evidence from them that is super important to carry some advocacy or awareness or some other legal strategies to try to bring this to the public attention. But it's like so often we don't get this evidence because the systematic practice of destroying or deleting or taking and the phones is making it impossible to have this evidence that in the end is the biggest weapon or tool we have for our work.
Yeah, and I think that was a super important point you brought up. Completely forgot to mention it, about how they use social media sometimes just for dehumanizing and ridiculing people. Half of our ground team here is themselves people on the move who once tried many times and then eventually gave up and decided to document this instead as much as they can. And then we joined forces because we were doing the same thing. So one of them, in his last pushback from Greece, he, like after he was back in Turkey, his sister, when he finally got a new phone and had contact to his family again, his sister told him that in this time that he was disappeared, like that he didn't respond, someone from his Facebook profile send messages to her. This guy saying, I'm a this and this, it was a Greek name, I'm a doctor or whatever, and sending nudes of himself to her, to his sister. And there are many cases like this where I don't know if it's police or if they just give it to some of their friends. I don't know. But yeah, that happens a lot. Yeah.
The disconnect here is just wild between what international law should say about this kind of surveillance that's supposed to come with proportionality and only be done when it's necessary, be targeted, have things like a judge reviewing it and authorizing it, and have forms of redress, to then just what's actually happening, which is just give us your phone and then we're going to do whatever we want with it or break it generally. Yeah, I mean, there's also like lots of these companies around that sell technology specifically for this purpose and targeted at, for example, people on the move. And some of the technology we had a look at a couple of years ago, kind of run through the technicalities of how it works. And they're still able to do things like collect data that's been deleted off it, collect photos and videos that have been deleted off the device, but that still kind of remain accessible to some of this technology. So that's out there as well. You mentioned earlier, Natalie, that in the registration process, they're asking for phones. Are they asking for, is it common like to collect biometric data of people when they're being registered as well?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not usually the case that they ask for phone make and model in registration. This was just in this case. But yeah, usually, I mean, this is official EU policy that people who apply for asylum are registered in a European-wide database, Eurodac. This, so yeah, like this, we need to differentiate here between like, this is not happening during pushbacks usually. There is, at least in our context here, we never had testimonies that said that they were first registered and then pushed back. But for everybody who applies for asylum, this is the norm, like fingerprinting, name, birth date, whatever, is all being registered and then shared European-wide. And there are many implications with that, of course, also. And I mean, in general, it's very clear that in this trend of like collecting information from asylum seekers and migrants is increasing consistently as well. And there's huge lobbying behind it, both from tech companies that sell border technology, like also border surveillance technology. On the Greek border, there's thermal cameras, movement detectors,
sound cannons as well.
So sound cannons, yes, sound cannons. Drones, of course, are very much used also on the Croatian and recently Austrian border. And yeah, there's a lot of technology that's involved in this, and there's a lot of lobbying behind this increase in securitization, both at the borders themselves and when registering asylum seekers. There's really, and there's, by the way, also some information about this that came through Freedom of Information requests at Frontex, about how expensive the dinners with these lobby groups are, and it's really concerning, to be honest. And I mean, basically what we or groups like us are trying to do is lobby for the rights of people on the move, and we cannot compete with that level of capital that they have.
And especially like as the processes and decisions are being decided behind closed doors, you have industry days where these companies will go and kind of pitch essentially the techniques, and you just don't know how much of that is actually driving the policy making and the decisions and the narratives that come from government, because in the background you have these very well financed lobbying technology companies who are pushing for that. Yeah, but with these data, if you are kind of lucky enough to be registered and to make it through the asylum process, a group called State Watch have done some great research on the databases that are available to EU border guards and to EU member states, and efforts to essentially centralize them and make them accessible across various EU countries and EU agencies, so that sometime in the next few years, for example, you'll have police who are just able to scan people's fingerprints and then get a whole background on people's data that they have on there. Let's encourage everyone to check that out.
One point that's also interesting when it comes to this technology question is, where is it not being used but would be useful? For example, there is no database of missing people, like no joint European database of missing people or deaths. We have this here because there's such an increase of people dying at the Greek-Turkish borders that we had to start this project trying to track missing people. So what we do is, at the border province in Turkey, there's 4 different districts. We have to go to the courthouse in each one of them to report people missing, because they don't even have a centralized system where this one province has an overview of which body is found where. Same in all the other countries I'm aware of. So it's also, I think, a really, really interesting point. Where is technology not used, but could be helpful?
Or to document some of the crimes that are happening.
Of course, yes.
Are you seeing kind of any other, what you might kind of widely call surveillance techniques that the border guards or police in the regions that you're working are using? For example, like wiretapping that's been used in courts against people.
This is, for me, or for us here in Turkey, this is a huge issue because the Turkish authorities, and this is, I mean, a direct result of European externalization policy that Turkey, by the way, also conducts pushbacks from Turkey to Syria, from Turkey to Iran, even more brutal than most of the EU borders. And the thing is that within Turkey, the Turkish government is basically using Instagram, TikTok, and so on to find people who are not registered in the country, and detain and deport or also illegally expel them. That's a huge thing here, and it's also happening in other countries in Europe, but it's not as systematic as here. And then in our criminal case, the only reason I'm involved in this criminal case is because phones were tapped, yes. And the same happened in many other cases. And there were other, like, search and rescue cases. One of my colleagues is involved in one of those from a previous organization she's worked for, where their ship was bugged. They had, for a few months, they were taping all the conversations in the ship. And then this case is also, this is the Juventa case, where it turned out almost a year ago, I think, that even the lawyers and the journalists working with this group, like journalists reporting about it and lawyers representing them, had their phones tapped for 8 months or something, which is completely illegal. And I mean, in any other context, I don't think that would fly with the general public. Like if it was about any other subject other than people working with migrants, this would not be acceptable at all.
You don't know if you've accessed any of the kind of detention camps that the EU has invested in recently. They're kind of subject to some pretty Orwellian new surveillance techniques. So kind of machine learning powered analytics that run through the cameras. So they're just constantly watching people and would essentially flag up any abnormal behavior. So you have to kind of make sure that you walk in ways that aren't going to raise any red flags.
I have not, because I mean, most of where the most technology like this is being used is in Greece, and I cannot enter the country. But yeah, I mean, yeah, totally. It's completely surveilled. As I haven't seen it myself, but I know people who have, and it's basically, yeah, living under Big Brother, and there's no privacy. There's no privacy in the games, anyways. Yeah, and what I find also really interesting in this context is how technology is also used to evade responsibility and accountability. Because Frontex, for example, this is in the Croatian context especially, Frontex is saying we are not present at the Croatian borders other than the official border crossings, but Frontex has provided Croatian police with lots of technological equipment that allows them to surveil the border. The footage is live streamed to the Frontex headquarters in Warsaw in Poland, and from there to the Croatian border guard stations. So whenever there's allegations about pushbacks in Croatia, Frontex is like, we are not present there. But they are facilitating it by live streaming footage from the border to the border guard stations in Croatia.
Another thing that became very evident, one of the things that we did manage to get through freedom of information requests was documents of training activities that EU agencies were providing to agencies in Northern Africa and the Balkans. And it was exactly kind of techniques that you mentioned. So how to monitor social media, how to do wiretapping, how to look through phones using specific software that's designed for that. So there's very much like a policy behind that to externalize these kind of surveillance practices that are used and developed in rich countries to essentially the neighboring ones around Europe.
In Croatia, in our case, like regarding technology, the most common issues with the drones, like we collect a lot of testimonies of people telling us that when they are trying to reach Croatia, sometimes they just listen to the noise of the drones. So at that moment, they realize that maybe in 30 minutes, 1 hour, the authorities, they are gonna show up and push them back. So it's like a daily reality that the people on the move trying to cross through the North Balkans is experiencing. The presence of this surveillance technology as drones, night vision, or like any sort of high technology to surveil that, as Natalie mentioned, is not present Frontex in the border, but they are really present because they are sending the information.
And not even high technology, it's like one of the projects that they're working on is providing capacity to non-EU countries who want to be EU members to develop databases to be able to enroll people in biometric systems that are then shared with EU countries. So they want to make them like interoperable with EU standards, but essentially that just means that they want access to the data of people who are coming to those countries also. In your kind of opinion, what is the long-term strategy here for the big EU countries and the European Union itself, or even is there one?
No, I don't think there is any. There's a complete lack of political vision and leadership in how to solve the it's not even a question for me, I think. I mean, migration has always been part of human history, and it only became a problem after we decided to establish nation states and have borders, and then make it increasingly selective who can cross those borders and how. And I think also in the context of globalization, it's completely illogical why all the goods, all the information, all I don't know what can travel globally, but people cannot, or certain people can, but everybody else cannot. And I mean, currently we are talking about 85 million displaced people worldwide, which is absolutely nothing compared to, for example, only the population of Europe. If we would just simply, like without making a fuss about it, just distribute those 85 million people equally or kind of equally across Europe, nobody would probably even notice or have a problem with it. But after decades of this securitization threat, that's the only reason why this is such a huge, or like probably currently the biggest challenge apart from the pandemic. And honestly, it's only 85 million now. But with climate change and so on, where we're also not acting and finding any really proper solutions, in a few decades, it will be billions. And honestly, I really feel like currently it's decision time. It's decision time to decide, do we find, or can we find a way, and do we want to find a way to live in solidarity globally, where everybody can survive and hopefully also thrive? Or do we want to have completely isolated places where maybe a small elite can have a halfway decent life and everybody else is suffering or like slowly dying? And I know this sounds super dramatic, but this is really where we're headed in the next 50 to 100 years, maybe. And I think this is the big challenge that we have to solve, like climate change plus how do we treat borders in the future? Because already now, even if we would now suddenly decide to find solutions to climate change that actually are implemented also, even then, the effects of what has already been done to the ecosystem would drive many more people out. And that would lead to, like, in general, also lead to more conflict, to more violent conflict, to more forcefully displaced people because of these conflicts, but also because of direct effects from climate change, not these indirects only. So I am hopeful that maybe we can find a solution, but I also currently don't see it at all.
So I guess that is one of the ironies that you kind of touched upon, is that the wealth of the EU has been built on free movement of people, but the price of that, unfortunately, recently has been that other countries have to stop that. And you have these like horrible examples of communities in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa that have traditionally migrated across what we would call borders, having to just all of a sudden stop because the EU has come in and said, actually, this is now a border zone and we're going to support the border authorities in enforcing and stopping nomadic communities from going across them. It's just a wild state of affairs. Sergio, are you as optimistic?
No. And I was remembering now when Natalie was talking about when the new pact on migration was presented on 2020, and the meaning behind the new pact was like, okay, the quota system was a failure, and Skinner's talking about the non-existence of European Union was the main reason, and they were trying to develop a more solidary system within the European Union. But the reality was that the tool for that will be like, if some members don't want to receive migrants, they can contribute economically, adding money to the surveillance or all the systems.
And deportation partnership or sponsorship.
So it was crazy, and I think it's so related with Natalie was mentioned before, the narrative behind the migrant as a threat that is super connected with the events in 2001, and how the securitization start to develop more and more, that is connected again with the lobbies that are under the business and the industry of surveillance. That is the same story with the war machine of weapons and all that surrounds that the machinery that is behind the huge business, the amount of money that is moving around. So I can see the same connection, that somebody has some interest that this continues the same, so the money can still move to like invest in surveillance and some new technology, more expensive. When we were talking about the new system of surveillance, and we were talking that people is still gonna come, I think that the only reality is that the people is gonna try to find new routes that in the end they're gonna be more difficult or dangerous routes. So probably we are gonna see more deaths even in the Mediterranean or the Balkans, or Ebros River in Greece with Turkey, or rivers in Croatia with Bosnia. So people is gonna still coming, but if the European Union and the border regime is going to make it harder and harder, the result is gonna be on a more precarious situation for people on the move.
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, we have people going, we have Cubans here, we have people from Haiti, from the Dominican Republic, from Colombia trying here because they couldn't get to the US. There are Syrians, there are, I don't know, other countries from the Middle East in Mexico trying to get to the US because they couldn't make it here. We have people come back to Turkey from Belarus after being stranded at the border there for several months. And there's an Iraqi family told us a month ago, they will now try, because they tried here 10 times, they will now try Libya, fully aware of what that means. People who don't have a choice keep trying. And the only way to stop them is to eventually probably just what already is happening with EU funds at the Turkish-Syrian border, just shoot people dead. It's happening already. There were some instances where that happened at the Bulgarian-Turkish border also. But I think the rate things are currently developing, this is where we're headed, that we are really fortifying ourselves to the point where we are just shooting people dead for trying to come. And that's only going to be possible if European countries or the European Union as a whole leaves lots of international treaties and changes lots of its own law. And this is already a discourse. The current Austrian chancellor, who used to be the interior minister last year, said literally, we have to discuss alternatives to human rights in the context of migration. We are that far where this is on the table, then maybe human rights are not something that we should have. Like, yeah, it's really frightening. And Sergio made a really important point, I think, about how this is connected to 2001 and what happened since then. This is all happening in the context of the global war on terror, which is the thing that's used, the threat of terror is the thing that's used in the security threat narrative, but it's also the laws that were established in the war on terror in Europe that is now used for criminalizing both migrants and people like us. So like I'm on trial in Greece on anti-terror laws, charges of anti-terror law. So this is all connected, and it's really clear it all serves to, as Sergio pointed out, just cement the current system and keep the power dynamic, like the power distribution globally as it is. But I mean, I think, to be honest, like there is a lot of positive also in this field. I mean,
you guys, for a start.
That's what I was going to say. If we didn't have the network of PBMN, I don't know if we could have continued as Chaussure, because this is such a hard job, and you are always in a precarious situation, not just because of criminalization and so on, but also because of funding issues, because of, you never know, like we here in Turkey, we have no idea how long are we tolerated in the country, because we also do report about Turkish violence. Anyways, it's a really precarious situation each of us are operating in, and I think having this cross-border solidarity network is giving a lot of motivation, inspiration, also of course like concrete stuff like exchange and so on. But for me personally, I think that the most important thing is knowing that there are many other people working on the same cause and willing to give up their, like we could all be chilling in our EU countries and have a nice life, but we are not, and we are not alone in this. And by the way, this is also, I think, the most important job. And we were talking about what can we support people with. Yeah, we can give blankets and food, but the most important thing is basically just treating people as people and be like, I acknowledge that you are a human and I treat you on eye level. And this is the feedback that we always get when we meet new people and so on. They're always like, I thought there's humanity in Europe. All of them here in Turkey say that. I guess it might be a bit different in the other borders, but like this is the first EU border that people usually come through. So they all say after the first pushback, I thought Europe has human rights, and then this happened, but now you show us that there is still humanity in Europe. And I think this, basically I see this struggle, all of our cause is just supporting the people who are actually the ones challenging the border regime. Everybody who is crossing the borders, knowing that this violence, this torture, this criminal acts are happening, they are really like challenging the regime. And all we can do is say, okay, we are there in spirit, mostly. I think this is our most important task, to be like, hey, you're not alone in this. And also, honestly, I mean, it's all a matter of luck, where and when you are born. If I would have been born in Austria 80 years ago, I would have been in that position probably. And it can happen to us anytime. I can also see, now we're going back to negative again, but I can also see that this actually breaks Europe, the European Union, and can lead to conflict on the continent again, and then maybe eventually we have to go somewhere else, and or us people working on this, maybe we get persecuted so much that we will have to flee. Any one of us could be in the same position. And I like to think that there would then be people who support me too, or at least be like, okay, I see you, and I see you as another human, not as, I don't know, someone whose life is worth nothing.
It's super important to keep fighting injustice and to keep trying to bring some awareness to the public society, because at some political level, doing advocacy, we can try to make some change in terms of legislation, migration policies. But I think this narrative we were talking about, super connected with the terrorist, war on terrorists, and the threatening of migration, is permeating to the public imaginary. And some people is still thinking that people coming from Afghanistan are Talibans who wants to make some attacks on Europe. I think once we achieve to start changing this, I think that will be the leverage to move the political side of the thing, and to bring some changes on this border regime. And I hope in the next years, decade, or centuries to get rid of this border regime. And then, as Natalie mentioned, we will talk about how inhuman was this situation right now, what was no sense situation that we are experiencing right now, that at some point is kind of normalizing what is going on after the events in Belarus and Poland, that for just a short period it was breaking news, but then the wave just goes down and disappears from the media and from the public attention.
And how can people help who are maybe just listening or watching this?
I think there's basically 3 things people can do. One is people can just share what's going on, talk about it, bring it to others, address it, and try to advocate in that way. People can, of course, also become active and do similar things, do the same thing in other areas, or join existing projects. I don't know. I personally never planned to do this. When you start getting active, and when you find some cause that you are passionate about, and you do one step, I think always it will be so it will just, everything will fall into place, and you will just I don't know, do 20 steps and be like, oh, how did this happen? I don't even know. And suddenly you're in a position where you actually where your voice is heard, and you actually can influence things, even if it's just a little bit. But I think that's the main problem why we are in the situation that we are in when it comes to many different subjects, but including this one, is that most people don't realize that everybody has the power to influence things. It might not be one person be able to change the world, but the only way to change and improve things is if normal people like every one of us decides to do whatever they can. And then lastly, of course, if people don't have the capacity, or for other reasons, no availability, then financially support people who are doing this. Unfortunately, that's a really, really, like I said already, really, really important thing, especially, by the way, with the increasing criminalization that leads to lots of funds rescinding support. We had a grant that was offered to us, and we already finished all the paperwork. It was 40,000 euros, which helps a lot here for us, a lot. And we had from the start told them about the criminal case. And then somehow, after they made us do all the bureaucracy, they still decided to say, oh, sorry, in our policy, actually, we cannot support anybody who is currently being investigated. So we have to rescind the offer. So yeah, basically, they're only funding us through private donations so far. And that's hugely important, even if it's just, I don't know, 2 euros per month. It makes a huge impact if everybody just decides to do whatever they can. Yeah.
And that's a Border Violence Monitoring Network online.
Yes, the website is borderviolence.eu, and we are also on Facebook and Twitter.
Please like support us financially to keep being there, taking testimonies, or like joining us with your energy, with your work to help, and also in the end to share all of this, to really make it not something normalized, to bring to your families, to your relatives, to your acquaintance what is going on. Because I think at the point we reach some critical mass, then we start having this momentum to really like overcome the situation and to maybe be able to have power to push forward some other different politics. So yeah, I will say to share all what is happening and to realize how wrong it is. I think that will be really the huge power from the people to make some change.
Definitely. I think it's important just how quickly things that look impossible can become inevitable if enough people take action. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for everything that you do. Good luck.